The two world wars of the 20th century marked some of the darkest moments in human history that are difficult to erase. To prevent the recurrence of such wars, major countries around the world exerted tremendous efforts at the negotiation table to maintain peace. However, after the two world wars, although the peoples of the world avoided the crisis of falling into another world war, the global standoff engendered by the two superpowers still dominated the planet for nearly 50 years of ups and downs. This period is known as the Cold War. This video will be the first episode in the Cold War series. In this video, to understand the causes and background of the Cold War, it is essential to have a comprehensive understanding of the diplomatic system established by the major powers after the war, the Yalta system. Speaking of the establishment of the Yalta system, the first issue that needs to be understood is why the Versailles system, established between the two wars, failed. In the shadow of the devastating First World War, leaders of the victorious nations convened at the Grand Palace of Versailles, setting the stage for a conference that would reshape international relations. On June 28, 1919, this assembly, fraught with tension and high stakes, gave birth to the Treaty of Versailles, a document that aimed to secure peace by punishing the vanquished, chiefly Germany. This pivotal moment marked the inception of the Versailles system, an ambitious yet ultimately unstable new world order crafted by Britain, France, and the United States. The Treaty of Versailles, crafted in the opulent halls where monarchs once danced, imposed severe penalties on Germany, stripping it of vital territories and economic resources. Despite its intentions, the Versailles system was marred by its inherent flaws and the punitive measures it enforced, which sowed seeds of resentment and economic despair within Germany. The treaty not only infringed upon German sovereignty, but also left the nation economically debilitated and socially volatile. In this breeding ground of discontent, the Nazi Party found its footing, exploiting the treaty's shortcomings to fuel its rise to power. The appeasement policies of the European powers, coupled with a lack of strong leadership from the U.S. due to its adherence to the Monroe Doctrine, only facilitated Germany's aggressive ambitions. Ironically, the system designed to prevent another major conflict was the same that contributed to the outbreak of World War II. The rise of the Nazis and their subsequent challenge to the Versailles system was not an isolated event, but a culmination of years of growing instability, diplomatic isolation, and economic hardship. Overall, the failure of the Versailles system was due to its inability to impose a punishment on Germany, the main instigator of the war, sufficient to prevent its resurgence, nor was it generous enough to allow the German people to forget the hatred of the war. This created a fertile ground for the growth of extremist organizations like the Nazis in Germany. Additionally, the impact of the economic crisis and the continuation of the Anglo-American strategy to balance power on the continent meant that the major countries of the free world failed to take strong measures during the development of the Nazis, instead opting to sacrifice the interests of smaller nations. This only whetted Germany's appetite, ultimately triggering the Second World War in Europe, which then spread globally. Additionally, the impact of the economic crisis and the continuation of the Anglo-American strategy to balance power on the continent meant that the major countries of the free world failed to take strong measures during the development of the Nazis, instead opting to sacrifice the interests of smaller nations. This only whetted Germany's appetite, ultimately triggering the Second World War in Europe, which then spread globally. Facts have proven that during World War II, the leaders of the Allied powers became aware of these issues and discussed them at the Yalta Conference in 1945. As the crisp February air swept over the Black Sea, the Grand Levadia Palace near Yalta stood as a silent witness to a pivotal moment in history. Inside, the chambers were filled with the echoes of past conversations that would shape the coming half-century. On a fateful day in 1945, three of the world's most powerful men, Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, convened to redraw the map of a war-torn world. The Yalta Conference, as it came to be known, was not merely a meeting, but a forge where the fate of nations was hammered out amidst the backdrop of the ongoing Second World War. The leaders arrived with their own agendas, shaped by national interest and personal conviction. Roosevelt, frail yet determined, sought to promote a United Nations that could ensure peace. Churchill, ever the imperial strategist, aimed to secure British interests and influence. Stalin, the iron-willed dictator, pursued recognition of Soviet sacrifices and territorial gains. Over 8 tension-filled days, the corridors and salons of Levadia Palace buzzed with activity. Military guards stood at attention, a stark reminder of the ongoing conflict, while aides and advisors scurried with papers and proposals. The atmosphere was charged with urgency and the heavy burden of decision-making. The trio discussed and debated behind closed doors, shaping agreements that would lead to the reorganization of post-war Europe. The Yalta agreements, though criticized in later years as a concession to Stalin, were a product of their time, decisions made by war-weary leaders who were desperate to secure peace, unaware or perhaps underestimating the long-term consequences of their choices. The core of their discussions, often intense and fraught with the pressure of impending military strategies and post-war visions, centered on several critical agreements that would come to be known collectively as the Yalta system. These agreements were meticulously documented, capturing the essence of Allied cooperation and the seeds of future discord. Division of Germany. One of the most significant decisions was the agreement on Germany's fate. The leaders decided to divide the defeated nation into occupied zones. This division was not only physical but also ideological, setting the stage for a divided Berlin and the eventual rise of East and West Germany. Formation of the United Nations. Amidst the discussions of war and territorial realignments, there was a profound commitment to a future of peace. The leaders agreed on the formation of the United Nations, envisioning it as a platform that would prevent future conflicts and foster international cooperation. This was a dream particularly close to Roosevelt's heart, who saw it as crucial to maintaining a peaceful world order. Secret agreements. Beyond the publicized decisions, there were covert agreements too. During the negotiations at Yalta, Roosevelt and Stalin paid special attention to the future geopolitical landscape of the Far East. In a closed room, the two leaders reached a secret consensus regarding Soviet demands for the southern Kuril Islands and Sakhalin Island. This agreement indicated the Soviet Union's formal entry into the war against Japan, but it also laid complex groundwork for the future geopolitical dynamics in Asia. Meanwhile, in another room, the discussion between Churchill and Stalin shifted towards the division of influence in Europe. Their talks solidified the so-called percentages agreement, which, though never formalized in writing, effectively decided the post-war fate of Eastern European countries. Under this informal agreement, the Soviet Union would dominate Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, while Greece would remain under British influence. These decisions, initially undisclosed, gradually leaked out after the war through various channels, sparking deep discussions about trust and responsibility among major powers. Particularly in Eastern Europe, these countries slowly realized that their futures had been shaped at a high-level negotiation table they never participated in. At Yalta, the leaders faced the monumental task of redefining the world order post-war, particularly focusing on the reorganization of war-torn Europe and the establishment of a framework for peace and security. The agreements reached at Yalta, though initially filled with hope and the promise of lasting peace, soon revealed their limitations and the complexities of their implementation. The essence of the Yalta agreements was deeply influenced by the immediate context of the war and the strategic positions of the powers involved. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the ground conflict against Nazi Germany, was in a position of strength. This leverage allowed Stalin to secure significant concessions regarding Eastern Europe, which he insisted must fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. Churchill and Roosevelt, acknowledging the necessity of Soviet support to conclude the war in Europe and the Pacific, were compelled to agree, albeit with reservations. The post-war reality, however, unfolded differently. The Soviet Union established a tight grip over Eastern Europe, enforcing communist regimes that aligned closely with Moscow's interests. This expansion and control starkly contrasted with the initial hopes of a free and democratic post-war Europe, as envisioned by Churchill and particularly Roosevelt, who had championed the cause of liberal internationalism and the establishment of the United Nations. The immediate years following Yalta witnessed significant events such as the Potsdam Conference, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the onset of the Cold War. The Yalta decisions were soon called into question as the world grappled with the onset of nuclear-age tensions and the division of Europe into Western and Soviet spheres. In conclusion, the Yalta system indeed resolved the root causes of the World War by completely eliminating unstable factors such as Germany and Japan through military occupation. Simultaneously, it is undeniable that the emergence of the United Nations successfully avoided the pitfalls of the previous so-called League of Nations and made a significant contribution to the cause of world peace. However, Yalta failed to resolve the contradictions between the free world and communist countries. By officially establishing the Soviet Union as a superpower after the war, it made it another pole of the world, creating a confrontation with the Western world, thus setting the stage for the early development of the Cold War. Given the considerations for collaboration to end the war as soon as possible, at the time, it is difficult to blame Roosevelt and Churchill for adopting an approach that leaned towards compromise and conciliation. However, it is undeniable that this indeed sowed the seeds of instability for long-term harmony that followed. Richard Nixon, reflecting on Yalta decades later, recognized the difficulties inherent in negotiating with the Soviet Union. His administration's engagement with the Soviet leadership in the early 1970s, culminating in the strategic arms limitation talks, was influenced by his understanding of Yalta's complex legacy. Nixon's reflections underscored a broader recognition of the nuanced nature of international diplomacy and the long-term consequences of decisions made under pressing circumstances. However, an expert on Soviet affairs soon expressed his views on the nature of the Soviet Union, which somewhat clarified Nixon's confusion. More significantly, the strategies he proposed, based on his analysis of Soviet characteristics, became a long-term guide for U.S. actions during the Cold War. Who is this expert? What strategies did he propose? Stay tuned for the next video.